They said no one could break it, a heavy iron collar that crushed bodies and spirits alike. But one young man dared to defy fate, to turn chains into a weapon, and spark a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of his captors. This is the story of courage, pain, and freedom, the story of the iron collar. The sun burned over the dusty square where men and women stood in rows, their wrists bound, their faces turned downward. Around their necks hung the dreaded mark of captivity, the iron collar. It was not just metal. It was humiliation forged into shape, a statement that freedom was no longer theirs. Among them stood a young man named Elias, barely 20, his skin blistered by heat, but his eyes still burning with defiance. The collar was heavy, rough against his skin, pressing into his bones whenever he moved. It had been hammered shut by a blacksmith, sparks flying as hot iron cooled against flesh. Elias remembered the clang of metal, the hiss of heat, the moment when his name was stripped from him. He was no longer Elias. To his captors, he was number 37. The number branded on a ledger replaced the sound of his birth name, a name his mother had sung when she rocked him as a boy. Each step reminded him of the collar's weight. Yet, in his silence, he clung to a stubborn thought. This iron is not my soul. The overseers could command his body, but his mind remained his own. He whispered to himself at night, "They can bind my neck, but not my heart." His fellow captives sometimes glanced at him in the barracks as though that spark of defiance in his eyes reminded them of something they had long forgotten. Hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope could bring lashes, or worse, death. Elias knew this. Still, he carried it. Every cut the iron made in his skin, every bruise from the whip became a proof of survival. Even iron rusts with time, he thought. One day, perhaps, it would break. That night, as the moon rose over the walls, Elias touched the collar around his neck and swore a silent vow. The iron may weigh him down today, but it would not define his tomorrow. Life beneath the collar was ruled not just by force, but by fear. Overseers patrolled with whips coiled at their sides like venomous snakes, striking whenever spirits rose too high. The whip sang through the air with a cruel whistle, each lash tearing open not only flesh, but dignity. Elias learned to move quickly, carrying sacks heavier than his body, shoulders bruised, the iron collar digging deeper as sweat streamed down his face. But Elias discovered something worse than the whip: words. Overseers mocked them endlessly, calling them beasts, reminding them daily they were less than men. "You are property," they sneered. "Freedom is for those above you, not for cattle." These words chipped away at the soul more cruelly than leather. Some men dropped their gaze, accepting the insult, breaking inside. Elias refused. When an overseer spat his name, no, his number, at him, Elias kept his eyes steady. He did not answer. He did not bow. His silence was louder than defiance. That unbroken gaze unsettled the overseer, as if Elias's refusal to surrender stripped the insult of its power. At night in the barracks, voices whispered in despair. The air was thick with hopeless murmurs, prayers that seemed unanswered. Yet, one old man, Davon, noticed Elias. His voice cracked with age as he whispered, "Boy, you're not like the rest of us. You still believe." Elias said nothing at first, but inside, he knew Davon was right. The collar burned his flesh, but it also lit a fire inside him. That fire whispered that the overseers were wrong, that chains could be broken, that the iron around his neck was not destiny. It was only a prison waiting to be escaped. The nights were the hardest. Rain leaked through the roof of the barracks, rats scurried across the dirt floor, and hunger gnawed at the belly. Yet those nights also carried whispers of lives stolen, of freedom once known, of dreams too fragile to speak aloud. One stormy evening, thunder rolled across the hills. Lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat, Elias saw beyond the fences. In that flash, he pictured his mother, her lullabies by the fire, his father's voice telling stories of warriors who bowed to no man. The memories stabbed at him, but also warmed him. They reminded him of what he had lost, and what he might fight to regain. Davin shuffled close in the shadows, his voice low. "Elias, if you still believe, then listen to me. Iron collars are forged by men, and what men forge, men can break." The words struck Elias like lightning itself. Could it be true? Could the unbreakable weight choking him actually fall? The idea consumed him. He began to watch everything with sharper eyes. The guards' patrol routes, the jingling of keys at the overseer's belt, the sparks at the blacksmith's forge where collars were shaped. Every detail became part of a puzzle. But planning meant risk. The punishment for even whispering escape was death, slow and brutal. Still, Elias's pulse quickened at the thought. Survival was no longer enough. For the first time, he dared to imagine freedom not as a dream, but as a fire waiting to be fanned. The moment came without warning. A boy no older than 15 staggered under the weight of a sack too heavy for his frail frame. His knees buckled and he crashed to the ground. The overseer's whip cracked in an instant, tearing open the boy's back, his cry piercing the air. Elias froze, rage pounding in his chest. Something inside him snapped. Before he knew it, he stepped forward, placing himself between the whip and the boy. The iron collar clanged against his chest as he lifted his chin and stared straight at the overseer. For a breath, silence. Then the whip came down again. Elias felt fire explode across his back, hot blood running down his spine. The pain was sharp, blinding. But he did not step aside. He stood tall, eyes burning with defiance. The square grew still. Every captive watched. The overseer raised the whip again, fury twisting his face, but before it fell, Davin's voice rang out. "Enough!" His cry shook the silence. Others followed, their voices trembling, then rising in strength. "Enough!" The overseer faltered. For the first time, Elias saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of a weapon, but of something greater. Unity. The iron collar could choke a man's neck, but it could not silence courage once it spread. Blood stained the dirt, but something far more, dangerous to the overseers, was born that day. Hope became louder than fear. Weeks passed, but the fire Elias had lit refused to die. Whispers of resistance spread through the barracks. Men who had long stopped dreaming now spoke of when, not if. The iron collar was still around their necks, but it no longer felt eternal. It felt fragile. One stormy night, when guards grew careless and rain-masked sound, Elias acted. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a small hammer he had stolen. His hands shook as he pressed it against the iron. He struck once. Twice. Sparks leapt in the darkness. His skin burned where metal bit into flesh. But he did not stop. Davin, his old ally, steadied his hand. "Don't stop, boy. Hit it like you're striking chains from us all." With a final blow, the iron split. The collar fell to the ground with a heavy clang. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a gasp spread through the room. Elias touched his neck, raw and bruised, but free. Tears blurred his vision. For the first time in years, he lifted his head without weight. The collar, once the symbol of chains, now lay broken at his feet. He turned to the others. What men forge, men can break. And what men can break, they can overcome. The words rippled like fire through the room. That night was not the end. It was the beginning. The iron collar was no longer a shackle. It was a weapon, a memory, proof that even the heaviest chains could shatter when courage struck. The night Elias broke his collar was the spark. But sparks, when fed by hunger and rage, become fire. In the days that followed, whispers turned into plans. Men who had once bent under the lash now looked at Elias with eyes full of something dangerous, belief. The iron collar was no longer a symbol of submission. It was a reminder of what could be destroyed. The overseers noticed the change. Fear flickered in their eyes as captives began to move differently, shoulders straighter, eyes unbowed, whips still cracked but the cries were fewer. Silent defiance had replaced broken obedience. Elias knew the time had come. On a moonless night, the captives gathered. Each carried tools stolen in secret, hammers, picks, scraps of iron sharpened into blades. Elias held the broken collar in his hands. He lifted it high and whispered, "Tonight, we stop being numbers." The words passed from mouth to mouth until the barracks trembled with murmured resolve. The gates were their first target. The guards laughed when they heard footsteps in the dark, thinking it was another desperate attempt. But this was no desperate attempt. This was an army born from chains. Davin swung the first strike, smashing a guard's torch from his hand. Others surged forward, shouting, voices raw but united. The overseers fought, but fear slowed them. They were not facing slaves anymore. They were facing men reborn. The iron collars clashed in the night, ripped from necks and hurled like weapons. The sound was deafening. Iron hitting stone, iron breaking iron. By dawn, the square was littered with shattered chains and silent whips. Elias stood at the front, chest heaving, blood on his hands but fire in his eyes. The collar he had broken now hung from his fist, a trophy, a symbol. Around him, men knelt, not in submission but in exhausted triumph. The overseers were gone, scattered like dust in a storm. Elias raised the collar one last time and shouted, "They tried to make us beasts, but today we proved we are men, free men." The cheer that followed rolled like thunder across the valley. The iron collar, once a prison, had become a banner of rebellion. The story of Elias would be told for generations, not of a slave who wore iron, but of a man who broke it. Elias broke the iron collar, and with it he shattered fear. Chains could bind bodies, but not courage. The captives were free, their spirits unbroken, and the spark of rebellion had begun. What was once a symbol of oppression became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the heaviest chains can be broken when the human spirit refuses to bow.